Have you ever heard of a settler's widow who rescued an Apache raider only to be forced into marrying him at her own cabin? It's one of the most gripping twists in our tale, a moment where survival duty and forbidden compassion collide in a single heartbeat. If you want to find out how two people on opposite sides of suspicion learn to trust each other against all odds, you're in the right place. But don't stop here. Listen on or read the full account to discover how their forced union transforms their lives and uproots everything they thought they knew. Along the way, you'll encounter questions of loyalty, prejudice, and love that defies convention. If this story intrigues you, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more captivating tales to light, and we'd love to have you join us on this journey. Prepare yourself for an unforgettable frontier adventure. Stay till the end to learn how it all resolves. Snow drifted from a sky heavy with its own secrets, each flake descending like an old memory that refused to fade. It blanketed the rough-hewn fences at the edge of Spruce Bend, piled gently along the brittle branches in the endless pines, and settled in the crevices of an old cabin that stood alone against the winter's hush. Inside that modest cabin, Emmeline Caldwell moved with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned to make silence a companion. She was a widow of 36 years, and in the town's judgmental eyes, that number held as much weight as the ring she no longer wore. People used to call her a fine wife when her husband James was alive. After he died, the townsfolk tried their best to offer pity, calling her a respectable widow, though that label sometimes felt like a shackle. Much of Emmeline's daily work was solitary and unremarkable, hauling buckets of water from the well out back, checking the woodpile to feed her cast-iron stove, and making sure her small goat Clover had enough feed. There was the horse in the lean-to stable too, an old chestnut gelding named Buck, whose name she had never bothered to change after James had chosen it. Most days she mended clothes or read last month's newspaper by lantern light, scribbling notes in the margins, as though holding a silent conversation with news from afar. Grief lingered in her life like an ever-present shadow, but she wore it gently, almost like she wore her apron, useful perhaps, but unremarkable enough to fade into the background. On an especially frigid day, the air was so cold it felt capable of splitting the thickest timber. Emmeline heard the wind moan around her cabin, but it was not the usual winter lament. Something in it sounded like a warning, a low, mournful cry that rattled her thoughts. Bundling herself in her thickest coat and tugging on James's old boots, still a size too large but serviceable, she set out to gather what scattered kindling she could find before the next wave of snow made the forest impassable. She gripped her hatchet firmly as she trudged through the drifts. In the depths of the pine grove, she spotted a darker shape in the white expanse. A single silhouette sprawled awkwardly near a cluster of broken logs. At first, her mind conjured the image of a wounded deer, or perhaps a lost traveler. But as she neared heart-pounding, she realized it was indeed a man. His skin was the deep hue of sun-warmed earth, his hair woven into braids that were matted with ice and faint traces of blood. The sash at his waist was soaked through, likely from a wound she couldn't see beneath the layers of snow-dampened cloth. Her mind shouted a single word shaped by the cautionary tales that drifted through Spruce Bend. Apache fear sparked within her memories of townsfolk, whispering about raids, horse thefts, and sudden violence. But she also saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the snow collecting in the hollows of his coat, and the thread of life that was slipping away with every passing second. Something inside her refused to look away. Against every instinct for caution, she laid down her hatchet in the snow and knelt beside him. She pressed trembling fingers to his neck, felt the faint pulse, and understood at once that leaving him there meant watching him die. With a burst of adrenaline, Emmeline leaned her shoulder into his limp weight, though she felt her muscles protest and the chill begin to sting. She willed herself forward. If saving him was folly, then it was a folly she would carry willingly. Survival, she suspected, did not always bow to reason. Dragging the unconscious man back to the cabin taxed Emmeline's strength to its very limit. Each step was a negotiation with the frozen ground, and every joint in her body ached as she fought to keep him upright. Once inside, she kicked the door shut behind her, barely noting the swirl of snowflakes caught in the gust. The warmth of the cabin's interior struck her like a reminder that the outside world was a deadly place for anyone too weak or wounded to stand. She eased him down close to the hearth where the embers glowed faintly. Her heart pounded, and she could see her own breath in short bursts as she fumbled for a better source of light. Without ceremony, she peeled the damp blanket away from his torso, revealing a bullet wound in his side, ugly, crusted with blood and ragged at the edges. The sash that had been wrapped there was more frieze than cloth, stiff to the touch. There was no time for half measures. Emmeline retrieved a basin of water warming near the coals, added a little more heat from the kettle, and began the slow work of cleaning away the grime and dried blood. She had no illusions about her medical skill. Her knowledge stemmed mostly from watching James patch up small injuries or from reading a borrowed copy of a farmer's almanac with a short section on wound care. Still, she kept her hands steady, pushing away the pang of fear that threatened to take over each time he moaned in pain. Unconscious though he was, gingerly she packed the wound with the cleanest scraps of cloth she could spare. The water turned a murky red as she rinsed out the sash he wore, noting the intricate beading along the edges. Whoever he was definitely more than just some lone wanderer. Everything about him, his braided hair, the careful detail in his clothing, suggested ties to a people who had long existed around these parts, too often at the receiving end of hostility. If the rumors in Spruce Bend were to be believed, trouble was never far behind. Night arrived quickly, the winter sky surrendering its light in a brief muted show of color. Emmeline brewed tea with pine needles, the sharp fragrance mixing with the scent of burning logs. She ladled a thin broth into a cup, hoping he might regain enough consciousness to drink, but he remained still, pinned to this world only by shallow breaths. She pulled her rocking chair closer and kept her rifle within arm's reach, uncertain what she should fear more, the possibility that he might never wake or that he would. During those hours, her thoughts turned unbidden to the townsfolk of Spruce Bend. She could almost hear the gossips at the general store. Emmeline Caldwell took an Apache man into her cabin. She's lost her mind. The idea made her shiver more than the draft seeping through the window. She wondered what James would have done were he still alive. He'd been decent in his own way, though, not always as kind as he might have been. Still, she suspected he wouldn't have let anyone die in the snow. The hours stretched. Outside, the wind pressed its weight against the walls, but inside she remained beside the stranger. Whenever his fever spiked, she cooled his brow, murmuring words she barely remembered from childhood prayers. And at intervals, she found herself touching her wedding band's outline beneath her glove, a habit she hadn't fully abandoned. Perhaps it was her own brand of fervent hope that one act of mercy might matter in a land so quick to turn cold. The next few days settled into a tense vigil. Emmeline hardly slept, choosing instead to doze in the rocking chair beside the hearth. Each morning she hesitated before walking out to do the chores, fearful she'd return to find him gone, or worse, that he might die alone. But slowly his condition began to improve. The raw edges of the wound looked less inflamed, and his breathing, while still ragged, took on a steadier pattern. She coaxed a little water down his throat each evening, just enough to keep him from parching. She noticed details about him during these silent hours. The shape of his jaw marked by a healed scar that angled over his cheek. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting he was neither very old nor a child. He carried beads woven into the braids of his hair, their colors worn by time and weather. Everything about him spoke of a life that had been lived on the move, close to the soil, under the vast southwestern skies. When he finally stirred, it was on the fourth morning, a day that dawned with a softer, pearly light filtering through the frosted windows. Emmeline was at the table sipping weak tea when she heard the quiet rasp of movement behind her. She turned to see him, blinking confusion etched into the set of his brow. His gaze flickered from the fire to her face, then settled on the bandage around his abdomen. She stood, her heart hammering, waiting to see if he'd speak, but he didn't. Instead, he watched her with eyes that gleamed like a banked ember. "You're safe," she said, not sure if he understood. Her voice felt oddly hushed in that small space. She gestured at the thick bandage across his side. "You were hurt." He tried to move, winced, and let out a low exhale that might have been a word in a language she did not know. She offered him a cup of water, which he took in both hands, pausing as if he expected her to snatch it back. He sipped slowly, each swallow a visible effort. Finally, he nodded in appreciation, an unspoken exchange as fragile as the dawn. Emmeline asked no questions. She figured he might need time to adjust, to gather enough strength or enough trust to speak. Besides, prying didn't suit her. In Spruce Bend, she'd learned that folks who asked too many questions often got answers they didn't want. She placed a bowl of thin porridge on the small table near the fire and pointed. Though he didn't speak, he watched her with a keen awareness that told her he understood more than he let on. As he healed, the cabin shifted in its very atmosphere. His presence was a gravitational pull that drew Emmeline's attention, even if she tried to focus elsewhere. She found herself fussing over his bandages or leaving an extra quilt within reach of at night. In quieter moments, she pulled out a yellowed almanac and read aloud more for herself than for him. Occasionally, she'd catch him listening, head tilted slightly, as if letting the gentle lull of her voice guide him through the pain. In those small moments, fear gave way to an odd sense of shared solitude. Two people bound by a winter that had in its harshness revealed an unexpected mercy. On the seventh evening since his arrival, she spotted him testing his legs, shuffling with one hand on the wall. She held her breath, torn between caution and a strange kind of pride. He glanced back at her, acknowledgement flickering in his gaze, but he said nothing and neither did she. Together, they let the silence speak of survival. When the first real thaw of the season arrived, thin rivulets of water began to snake across the packed snow outside, whispering that winter might be losing its grip. Emmeline had left the stranger still a stranger in name, at least propped in a chair near the window. She busied herself with the chores of a woman too long accustomed to doing everything alone, fetching water from the well, chopping the remnants of her woodpile, and trying to coax Clover the goat into producing just a bit more milk. He watched her work. She noticed that without meaning to notice, if she carried a pail of water, she'd feel his gaze tracking each step. If she leaned down to tie her boot, she sensed his eyes flicker with concern when she paused, wincing at a twinge in her back. Soon he began offering small gestures of help. With slow, careful effort, he'd make his way to the doorway, bracing his weight on the rough-hewn doorframe. Once he even took the bucket from her hands, grimacing but determined to carry it the short distance back inside. It was after such a moment that she set down the bucket, breath clouding around her face. "Thank you," she murmured, not certain if he would understand. He nodded once, pressing a hand gently against his bandaged side before limping back to his chair. There was no sense in scolding him for overexerting himself. It was clear that he was the sort of man who took his dignity as seriously as his survival. That night, with the fire crackling in an otherwise quiet cabin, she read from an old newspaper. It contained mundane headlines about a cattle auction in a neighboring county, a dispute over a missing mule, and a single line hinting at trouble with roaming Apache bands near the territory. The line made her stomach tighten. She glanced at the man, half expecting him to show anger or fear, but his expression remained inscrutable. Instead, he pointed at a line of text, something about the price of barley, and looked at her questioningly. She tried to explain in plain words, tapping the syllables as though teaching a child. His nod suggested understanding, though whether it was feigned or genuine, she could not tell. Days melted into one another, and with each passing hour, the invisible boundary between them softened. She tried to unravel his name by gesturing to herself and saying Emmeline in a slow, careful tone. He watched her, then repeated Emmeline, though his accent gave it a gentle twist. She touched her chest, nodded vigorously. Emmeline. Then she placed a hand lightly on his arm, encouraging him to do the same. He hesitated, eyes flicking to hers, and then said Nantan. She was not certain if she repeated it correctly. Nantan, but the slight lift of the corner of his mouth told her she was close enough. That night she sat awake long after he'd drifted to sleep, quietly turning his name over in her mind. It felt like a secret entrusted to her. She found herself gazing at him the way the firelight traced shadows across his cheekbones. She no longer pretended this was a temporary arrangement. She sensed the inexorable shift of something that might tether them in ways neither had asked for, but both had begun to accept. Still, a chill crept into her thoughts whenever she imagined the townspeople discovering him here. She'd heard the rumors of stolen horses and bloodshed on far-flung ranches. She'd also heard how fear twisted everything out of shape, how it made men trigger-happy and quick to label others as enemies. But in the gentle glow of her lamplit cabin, she saw only a man who had nearly died in the snow, and she wondered how easily that truth would be swallowed by the larger narratives of blame. By the time Nantan could move about the cabin more confidently, Emmeline realized that the gossip in Spruce Bend might already be circling like wolves in the dark. She made a routine trip to the settlement one chilly morning, riding Old Buck while the world was still gray with half-light. Her stomach knotted when she considered what might happen if folks learned she had an Apache man under her roof. She could almost hear their voices, the merciless condemnation, the sly remarks that she must have been bewitched or taken advantage of. Hitching Buck to the post outside the mercantile, she steeled herself against the cold. Inside, the clerk gave her a wary glance. This was a man she had known for years, but lately he acted as if her presence carried a silent scandal. She picked up staples, salt-flour coffee, and waited at the counter. He counted out her change, dropping the coins into her palm without letting their eyes meet. Something in his manner made her think he had heard rumors, but wasn't bold enough to ask. She left with her parcels packed neatly, a sour taste in her mouth. Passing the sheriff's office, she glimpsed Sheriff Emmett Granger peering out from his front window. He did not tip his hat or smile the way he once had. Instead, he watched her with a flatness that made her uneasy. She knew the man was known for his approach to keeping order in Spruce Bend, often resorting to methods that many might call heavy-handed. The thought of him ever turning that methodical gaze on her and Nantan made her own stomach twist. Back at the cabin, she found Nantan mending the handle of a small hatchet by the fire. He looked up at her entrance. She saw relief in the angle of his shoulders, a silent exhale that she'd returned safely. Setting down her parcels, she approached him, uncertain how to convey the sense of foreboding that had settled over her. "Town is uneasy," she said, simply hoping the words would carry. "They suspect something." Nantan held her gaze. She could tell he was searching her face for meaning. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Danger," he said, voice quiet but resolute. She nodded in return, not sure how much more needed to be said. That evening, the wind rattled the shutters like an omen. Over a meal of bread and leftover stew, she recounted what she had seen in town. She described the suspicious clerk, the sideways glances, and the silent, watchful stare of Sheriff Granger. Nantan listened carefully, though he seldom responded, save for the occasional question in halting English. "They come soon?" She wasn't certain. Fear pressed against her throat. "I don't know," she admitted, "but Spruce Bend is restless." Later, she retrieved James's old rifle from the dusty corner and cleaned it by the fire. Her hands worked with a calm born of necessity, each motion steady as if preparing for a hardship that might arrive at any moment. Nantan observed her, then stood to retrieve a bow from his meager belongings. The act felt symbolic, like a merging of two different ways of survival under one roof. Their eyes met across the firelight, and something unspoken passed between them. A resolve, a promise that they would face whatever came next. In the hush of that night, Emmeline again found herself wondering if she had any regrets. The question gnawed, but the answer was clear. As the night sky, she did not regret saving him. Not for a moment. They formed an unspoken routine of small, necessary tasks. Emmeline showed Nantan how to brew pine needle tea and sweeten it with the scant molasses she had. In turn, Nantan demonstrated how to set snares in the nearby woods, weaving the loops from lengths of twine Emmeline had once intended for sewing. By late afternoon, the two of them would gather to check the traps occasionally, finding a rabbit or squirrel to supplement their meager rations. Quietly, they fell into a rhythm, one that could almost be mistaken for domestic harmony, if it weren't underscored by the tension that crackled whenever a horse's distant hoofbeats reached their ears. One day, as the snow began to recede in earnest, Emmeline was out by the small fenced enclosure meant for Clover when she noticed fresh horse tracks at the tree line. The sight made her heart pound. These tracks were neither hers nor Nantan's. They were narrower and deeper, suggesting someone had ridden close, perhaps to observe. She returned to the cabin, cheeks flushed, and found Nantan inside working quietly to carve a small figure out of a scrap of wood. When she told him about the footprints, he nodded gravely, then set aside his carving. He stepped outside to examine the tracks, kneeling in the slush to place his hand in the impressions. Emmeline could see the tightness in his posture, the way his shoulders drew inward. There was no question that someone had come close enough to see the thin line of smoke from her chimney. A rider approached openly. For the first time, Emmeline was gathering kindling near the cabin door when she heard the hoofbeats. By the time she looked up, 3 men were dismounting, their breath fogging in the late winter chill. At their head was Sheriff Emmett Granger. Flanking him were 2 ranchers, Lucas and Wade, both of whom Emmeline recognized vaguely from around Spruce Bend. Their hats were pulled low, but she could see the suspicion etched into their expressions as clearly as footprints in new snow. Afternoon. Mrs. Caldwell Granger said, a veneer of politeness stretching tight over his tone. Lucas shifted his hand, resting on the butt of his revolver. Wade looked at her with flickers of discomfort. Emmeline kept her voice level. "Sheriff." Granger cleared his throat, glancing at the thin column of smoke rising from her chimney. "Folks are saying you are nursing a stranger here. An Apache." His words dropped like stones. "Mind if we come inside?" Her heart hammered, but she refused to let it show. "I expect I can't stop you," she said, stepping aside. And inside, Nantan stood near the hearth, his posture alert but not aggressive. His eyes flickered to Emmeline, reading her fear and bracing for what might follow. The tension in the small cabin became a tangible weight. Lucas's lips curled in disdain at the sight of Nantan. Sheriff Granger's expression was guarded, as if he too was assessing the situation for the simplest explanation. Well, seems the rumors were true, he muttered. There's talk of raids. A few ranches got hit near the outskirts. Horses stolen, a couple of ranch hands killed folks or pointing fingers. Emmeline stepped between them. He's been here healing from a bullet wound, one that nearly cost him his life. If there was a raid, he couldn't have been part of it. Wade's eyes flicked to Granger. Could still be trouble, he said quietly, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Sheriff Granger exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw. The town wants peace. They want to know folks in these hills aren't harboring men who might turn on them. We can't let this stand. Mrs. Caldwell. Nanton stayed silent, but his stance spoke of dignity. Emmeline's voice shook as she replied, He's no threat. Look at him still wounded. A moment of uneasy silence stretched. Then Granger turned to Emmeline, his gaze shifting to something like pity. If you want him to stay alive, he said, there's only one way this goes down. Emmeline's stomach twisted. She could feel the words coming before he uttered them. They would force a wedding upon them, an official piece of paper that would sanctify Nanton as her husband and place him under the dubious protection of the town. We'll do it here, Granger added. Now, in less than an hour, Spruce Bend's makeshift justice was delivered straight to Emmeline's cabin. A clerk was summoned along with a preacher, whose eyes darted nervously around the room. No one brought flowers or smiles, and there was no music except for the crackle of the fire. Outside snow gathered in the muddy footprints that the men tracked in a silent witness to the forced union. Emmeline stood with her hands clasped, a sense of unreality spinning around her. She had once worn white in this very cabin on the day James had taken her hand in marriage. That day felt like a dim memory from another life. Now she stood opposite Nantan, who wore a borrowed shirt buttoned high to hide the healing wound. They exchanged no vows of love, no tokens of affection. The preacher stumbled through the words, as if repulsed by the very act, but compelled by Sheriff Granger's presence to finish it. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Nanton's expression was unreadable. Emmeline lowered her eyes, pressing her lips tightly together to keep from saying something that might endanger him further. The piece of paper, the clerk waved a marriage certificate listing their names, felt like a brand rather than a blessing. She glimpsed the awkward scrawl that passed for Nanton's signature. The clerk had insisted on calling him Nathan or something else similarly mangled, but Nanton made his mark with a careful steadiness. Granger let out a breath and clapped Nanton on the shoulder in a gesture meant to seem friendly. Congratulations, he said, though no one believed he meant it. You'll be a part of Spruce Bend now. Folks here will keep an eye on you. Make sure there's no trouble. Lucas smirked while Wade looked everywhere except at Emmeline's face. The small congregation of men packed up as quickly as they'd arrived, their boots stomping the slush off onto her floor. In a swirl of cold air, they were gone, leaving behind only the echo of a life-altering event. Emmeline stood there stunned, feeling more like a piece of property than she ever had before. Eventually, she closed the door on the winter wind and turned to Nanton. He hadn't moved. The new husband label hung between them like smoke from a snuffed-out candle. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Gathering her composure, she finally managed, I'm sorry, I didn't see another way. Nanton's gaze remained steady, though his jaw tightened. I understand, he said softly. The few words of English carried a resignation that cut her more deeply than any bitter remark could have. They sat in silence by the fire, the official paper lying abandoned on the table. Emmeline found herself staring at it, half expecting it to burst into flame from the heat of her anger and helplessness. She was his wife now, according to the laws of Spruce Bend, laws that could turn on them at a moment's notice. Before the last streaks of daylight vanished, Nanton rose and slipped outside. Emmeline watched him go, unsure whether to follow or leave him to the solitude he so clearly needed. She understood that they were bound together in a way neither had wanted. The cabin that had once provided shelter from the cold now felt too small, too confining. When he returned, he brought with him a carved figure that resembled a hawk with its wings half extended. He handed it to her wordlessly. She held it against her palm, feeling the careful grooves and imperfections in the wood. It was his unspoken way of saying that what connected them was deeper than forced signatures. Life with Nanton settled into a careful dance in the aftermath of that coerced ceremony. Emmeline rose early as she always had to tend to Clover and prepare what little breakfast they could share oatmeal, if they had the supplies or whatever game Nanton snared in his traps. Some mornings they only had tea in silence. Other days, a tenuous warmth flickered between them, as if each recognized the other's steadfastness and quietly admired it. The snow was beginning to melt for good, revealing brown patches of earth that hinted at the promise of spring. Emmeline found the seeds she had stored in a tin box, bean squash, a handful of herbs, and on a whim she offered them to Nantan. "We could plant these," she said one afternoon, her voice breaking the hush. "If we decide to stay." Her meaning trailed off, uncertain whether they truly had a choice. Nantan turned the small seeds over in his hand. She watched his expression. It was thoughtful, almost reverent. After a moment he nodded, and they marked out a small patch of soil near the cabin, turning it over with an old spade. Emmeline expected him to ask about leaving, about returning to whatever homeland was still out there for him. But he remained quiet. She imagined that the world beyond Spruce Bend might offer him no greater safety given how the tensions in the territories had escalated. One evening, Emmeline discovered a faint melody in the stillness. It took her a moment to realize that Nantan was humming a low rhythmic tune that seemed to emanate from deep within his chest. She sat quietly, letting the notes wrap around her in the dim lamplight. When he noticed her listening, he paused. She shook her head as if to say, "Don't stop." He hesitated, then continued the wordless tune, filling the space between them with a tenderness that no forced marriage decree could claim. They grew closer in incremental steps, like the slow thaw of ice around the edges of a pond. Emmeline found small ways to express her care, laying a second blanket on his bedroll, stitching up his coat, reading him passages from her almanac, even though she was never sure how much he understood. In return, Nantan showed her how to read the clouds for signs of oncoming storms, how to spot edible roots by the patterns of their leaves, and how to fix snares so they wouldn't harm animals they didn't intend to catch. Yet an undercurrent of unease persisted. The knowledge that the town was watching, that Sheriff Granger or one of his men might appear at any moment, cast a constant shadow. Emmeline went to the mercantile less often, preferring to stretch their supplies. On her rare visits, she sensed eyes on her as she walked the single muddy street, overheard half-coherent murmurs of traitor and Apache lover from corners where old men nursed their resentments. Each slur cut her deeply, but she kept her head high. She confided these troubles to Nantan one afternoon as they sat by the newly tilled garden plot. He listened, silent and intent, his dark eyes reflecting a sympathy that words could not fully capture. She finished by saying, "I wish there were a place we could both just exist without all this." He pressed his palm to the cool earth as if drawing strength from it. "We make our place," he answered softly. The suggestion glimmered with the promise that neither had to live solely by the terms of Spruce Bend. In that moment, Emmeline felt a flicker of a bond that was greater than duty, deeper than fear. And then on a morning crisp with the scent of pine, everything unraveled. Emmeline sensed the trouble before she saw it. A lone rider passed by the cabin, not stopping but slowing enough to peer at the window. His expression, though partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, carried a look of grim purpose. She watched him go, heart thrumming like a frightened bird's. By noon, 3 more riders appeared among them. Lucas, who had once smirked during the forced wedding, and Wade, whose face was drawn. A new man led them, wearing the badge that once belonged to Grangerward in town. Had it that Granger had stepped down amid health issues, leaving this deputy in charge. Clayton Ross, afternoon said. Ross's tone all stiff formality, he kept his horse at a short distance, while Lucas and Wade spread out to either side. Nantan stepped onto the porch, bow in hand, but lowered. Emmeline felt an immediate knot in her stomach, recalling all the overheard whispers about how some ranches had again been raided. Ross dismounted, squaring his shoulders. "We're here for him," he said simply, pointing at Nantan. "He's under suspicion for the latest raid near Bitter Creek. Horses went missing. 2 men shot, word as an Apache was spotted riding off." Emmeline's voice shook. Nantan's done nothing. "He's been here with me. Besides, he's legally my husband now." Lucas spat in the dirt, eyes flaring with contempt. "That piece of paper don't matter if he's guilty of murder." Wade, looking uneasy, kept his rifle pointed downward. "Maybe he's innocent, maybe not. Folks in town are riled, and the law's the law." Emmeline's anger flared. "You have no proof. He never left my sight long enough to." Her words were cut off by Ross stepping closer, letting his hand rest on his holster. "Ma'am, we can't risk the chance that you're lying to protect him. The people want justice." He locked eyes with Nantan. "If he's innocent, we'll find out. But he's coming with us, alive, if he cooperates." A moment stretched too taut for comfort. Emmeline felt the tension in Nantan's body, the quiet coil of readiness, as though he might fight or flee. She saw how the men bristled hands inches from their weapons perched on the knife edge of violence. She forced herself between them, ignoring her own trembling. "You'll have to shoot me if you plan on taking him," she hissed. Ross's eyes flickered with something like regret, but he did not back down. "Ma'am, don't make this harder. I don't want to harm you." Time seemed to slow. Nantan's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder, urging her aside. She felt the warmth of his palm through her coat, and with that small touch, she realized he was prepared to spare her, even if it meant surrendering himself. But something else cracked in that tension-filled moment. A burst of panic from Lucas. His rifle swung upward, and a single shot rang out. Emmeline heard it before she felt the impact. A sharp burning pain tore through her side, and she stumbled. The world tilted. For a second, she saw the sky impossibly blue. Then Nantan's arms were around her, lowering her to the ground. Ross shouted something furious at Lucas, while Wade stood aghast. Emmeline tried to speak, but the pain flared bright as lightning. Nantan's voice rumbled close to her ear, his hand pressing against the wound, trying to staunch the blood. She heard hooves, voices, chaos. Then Ross's voice shouted, "Enough, damn it! We're done." The ring of riders blurred, and Emmeline faded into a swirl of pain and muffled fear. Emmeline awakened to the rustle of wind through pines and the warm smell of a campfire. For a few disoriented seconds, she expected to see the familiar beams of her cabin overhead. But as she blinked, she realized she was lying on a makeshift pallet in the shelter of some rock outcroppings, sky open above. The pain in her side returned with a throbbing insistence. She tried to sit up and found Nantan kneeling beside her, pressing a hand gently to keep her still. Where she managed her throat dry. He offered a canteen. "Far enough," he said simply, voice laced with exhaustion. "We left the cabin after you were shot. Didn't trust they had let us be." Slowly, fragments of memory returned the confrontation with Ross. Lucas firing in panic, the shock of the bullet. She glanced down at her side, seeing a bandage and dry blood. "Lucas's shot, it wasn't too deep. Was it?" Nantan shook his head. "Went through clean, but you lost blood." Despite his stoic tone, she could hear a tremor of worry in it. She surveyed their surroundings, a hidden hollow, circled by stony walls and a canopy of pines overhead. This was not the range near Spruce Bend. She wondered how many miles Nantan had carried her or helped her ride. "What about the cabin?" she asked, heart clenching. He exhaled, lowering his gaze. "I burned it," he said softly. "No. Home left there. Easier for them to follow a trail if the cabin stood." Tears welled in Emmeline's eyes. That cabin had been her last physical link to James, to a life she once thought would be her forever. Yet she understood. If they'd stayed or if the townspeople had returned, the outcome could have been far worse for both of them. "All right," she murmured, forcing a semblance of acceptance. In the days that followed, Nantan tended her wound with simple remedies. Boiled water, clean strips of cloth, and herbal poultices gleaned from the forest. Emmeline marveled at his patience. He barely slept more than a few hours at a time, always keeping watch, always ready to hush the campfire at a moment's notice. If he sensed danger once, in a feverish half-sleep, she dreamt that he was singing again, that same low tune from the cabin. When she opened her eyes, the faint echo of his hum still swirled in the night air. Her strength returned in small increments. She managed to stand with help, then walk a few steps, and eventually gather pine kindling while he hunted. They had no permanent shelter, just the sky and a few tarps he had scavenged from the cabin before burning it. In her more lucid moments, Emmeline recognized that she felt a clarity she hadn't had before. Freed from the constraints of Spruce Bend's judgments, in that forced piece of paper, she and Nantan were forging something real, an alliance, a partnership, maybe even a quiet form of love. They ventured south, skirting the ridgelines and moving through passes that only Nantan seemed to know. Some nights they would find a narrow ravine or a copse of cedar to make camp far from any roads or the watchful eyes of strangers. Emmeline's wound continued to heal, leaving her with a deep scar at her side. She touched it sometimes, recalling the bright, sudden flash of pain and marveling at how close she had come to never seeing another dawn. One late afternoon, they paused to make camp in a nook near a shallow creek. The water trickled gently over smooth stones, and the sun gilded everything with an amber glow. After settling down, Emmeline unwrapped the carved hawk from a piece of cloth she kept in her satchel. She cradled it in her hands, remembering the day Nantan had given it to her in the cabin. She glanced at him, watching the tension in his shoulders ease now that they were safely hidden. "You said birds carry messages between worlds." He nodded, crouching beside her. "Yes." She hesitated, running her thumb along the hawk's wooden wings. What's our message? Nantan was quiet, then placed his hand gently over hers. We survived, he said, voice low but resolute. In the weeks that became months, they carried on building small fires, sharing half-whispered stories in two different languages, and planting seeds of trust wherever they paused. Sometimes the seeds were literal. Emmeline's meager store of beans found pockets of fertile soil by certain streams. Other times the seeds were moments of laughter or the press of her cheek against his arm as she drifted off to sleep. They never returned to Spruce Bend. Occasionally, Emmeline thought of the townsfolk, of Sheriff Granger's uneasy replacement, and of the small coterie of people who might wonder what had become of her. But she could not bring herself to regret the path she'd taken. She thought of that forced marriage paper which had aimed to bind her and Nantan under a yoke of necessity. In the end, it was their choice to stay together that mattered, not a signature on a page. And so they continued forward, forging a new life in the quiet spaces the world had all but forgotten. If a traveler stumbled across their camp by the creek, they might see a lean-to shelter, two horses grazing side by side, and catch the soft murmur of two voices harmonizing in the hush of dusk. Then if they looked closely, they'd notice a carved hawk perched on a rock, wings spread as though ready to carry a message of survival and hope to any who still believe such things could exist in a land too often defined by borders and fear. In that small, hidden corner of the wild, Emmeline Caldwell and Nanton found the freedom to breathe, to heal, and to claim each other over and over, not out of force or fear, but out of a quiet, stubborn love that refused to die in the snow. Looking back on this journey, I see more than fear and forced decisions. I see hope born in the quiet moments, the shared meals over a single flame, the careful tending of a small garden, and the unspoken kindness in two people who refused to let the winter claim them. From a personal perspective, it's a powerful reminder that empathy can bloom in even the harshest terrain. Emmeline and Nanton showed us that compassion sometimes arrives uninvited and demands everything of us, yet rewards us with a sense of belonging. No paper or decree can provide. I hope this story leaves you with a renewed faith in love's ability to bridge cultures and defy society's expectations. If you have thoughts, questions, or your own tales of courage to share, please comment below. Let's keep the conversation going and learn from each other's experiences. Thank you for joining us. Your presence and insights mean more than you know.